Welcome back, everybody. We're diving into something a bit different this time around. We're looking at the concept of spiritual warfare, something that, a lot of our listeners have asked about.
Yeah, definitely it comes up.
But we're looking at it through this really unique devotional that you found by Pastor Guy.
Pastor G, that's right.
And it's called Fight, Fight, Fight.
Yeah, it's got a really kind of attention-grabbing title, right?
Yeah, for sure. So before we jump into the text, what was it about his approach in particular that stood out to you?
I think for me, what really grabbed me was just how relevant he makes this idea of spiritual battle. You know, it can feel like something really ancient or out of touch, but
Yeah.
he brings it right into the modern world.
Yeah, I mean, he uses that story of Daniel in the lion's den,
Right.
but then he doesn't just stop there. He digs into all these different
Exactly.
challenges that Christians face today.
Yeah, and he doesn't shy away from it. Like you said, the title, Fight, Fight, Fight.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a call to action right there.
It definitely grabs your attention.
Yeah.
And you mentioned feeling maybe a little conflicted by that kind of language. Like, what felt a bit off to you?
Well, I mean, when you think about Christianity, a lot of times you think about love and peace. So this whole imagery of fighting felt a little bit, out of place.
Right.
But as I kept reading, I realized he's not talking about, like physically fighting. He's using fight more as a metaphor for, resisting all those negative influences and staying true to your faith.
Okay, so that makes sense. So he's kind of setting up this framework. And to illustrate this, he uses this really powerful analogy between ancient Babylon and the modern world.
Exactly. And he uses King Nebuchadnezzar and the whole Babylonian system to represent all those pressures and temptations that can pull Christians away from their faith. He even breaks it down into these really specific symbolic parallels, which I thought was super interesting.
Okay, so let's dive into some of those. I know you've been struggling with like a sense of disconnect in your church community lately, and Pastor Guy talks about the fallen king representing defeated spiritual leaders or, compromised family structures. Does that resonate with you? Like, does that ring true to your experience at all?
It totally does. Lately, I've been feeling like the leadership in my church is, they're not really living up to the ideals they preach, and it's left me feeling really disillusioned.
Right.
So reading about the fallen king made me think, maybe even those in positions of authority, they're vulnerable too.
Yeah.
It's not about judging them, but maybe trying to understand the pressures that they're facing.
That's a really good perspective, and it actually ties into another one of the parallels that he draws. He talks about the plundered treasures, right? And he says they represent the loss of spiritual blessings or worldly success because of these external forces. Do you feel like some of your treasures have been plundered? Maybe your sense of community or spiritual fulfillment, something like that.
I think that's a really powerful way to put it, actually. I definitely feel a sense of loss. And, calling those feelings plundered treasures.
Yeah.
It helps me to, validate my own experience instead of just kind of brushing it off.
Yeah. It's like you acknowledge the wound before you can start to heal it, right?
Absolutely.
So he doesn't just stop there. He goes on to talk about figures like Ashpenaz, who represents those forces that are trying to corrupt young people. And then the youth of royal lineage. And they represent all Christians who are called to stand strong. He's really building this image of this epic spiritual battle.
Yeah, it's like he's creating this whole battle plan, right?
Yeah.
Like laying out all the different players and what's at stake.
Exactly. And he even goes on to point out the specific weapons that Christians can use in this fight.
Oh, yeah, the weapons.
But they're not, swords and shields or anything. He's talking about things like sexual impurity, laziness, bad company, and vices. These are the things that can, weaken a Christian's connection to their faith. I thought it was really interesting how he labels key point 30,
No.
free from the spirit of Babylon.
Oh, yeah. It's a really bold statement.
It is. It's like a declaration of independence almost from all these
Yeah.
negative influences.
Absolutely.
And it made me think about my own Babylonian education, as Pastor Guy calls it.
Mm-hmm.
Like those secular influences that pull us away from our values. For me, it's definitely like the constant barrage of negative news and social media. What about you? What feels like a Babylonian education in your life?
I think for me, it's more like the pressure to achieve worldly success, even if it means, compromising my values or neglecting my spiritual life. It's that constant striving for more, more, more. And it's everywhere these days.
Yeah, it really is. And recognizing it as like a Babylonian education, like you said, it helps to name it, define it, and maybe even start to dismantle it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Pastor G, he actually provides some really concrete tools for doing just that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he offers all these specific prayers. He calls them key prayers 30. And they're designed to help people, combat all these negative influences.
Oh, wow. And are they like traditional prayers?
Well, not really. I mean, they're filled with this really vivid imagery. He talks about things like, exercising hands for combat and demons being struck with blindness.
Oh, wow.
It's pretty intense.
That language is a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, I can see that. It's definitely not your typical Sunday school language.
Yeah.
But I think it speaks to, how deeply he feels about this, how seriously he takes this whole concept of spiritual warfare.
And he's not just talking about individual battles either, right? He calls for like collective action. He urges the church to unite in this fight. What's your take on that, especially given, your recent experiences with your church community?
It's funny because I've been feeling really isolated lately, like I'm fighting all these battles on my own.
Right.
So when he talks about this need for unity, it really resonates with me.
Yeah.
But it also kind of highlights, what's missing for me right now. It makes me wonder, what happens when that support system breaks down?
That's a really good question. And it actually leads to another really interesting point that he brings up. This whole discussion of the mark of the devil and its removal. You mentioned that this passage really stood out to you.
Yeah. It's something I'm still kind of grappling with, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, on one hand, I understand it within the context of his whole, spiritual warfare metaphor. It's about cleansing yourself of all the negative influences and aligning yourself with God's will. But then on the other hand, it does feel a little bit extreme,
Yeah.
Like, where's the line between spiritual guidance and control?
That's such a good point to bring up. But before we go there, I think it's worth highlighting that verse that he quotes from 1 Timothy 6.2, Lynn.
Oh, yeah.
He reminds his readers to fight the good fight of faith, lay hold on eternal life, to which you were called, and have confessed the good confession in the presence of many witnesses. Even within this like intense call to action, there's still this message of hope and victory.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to the core of what he's saying, which is that this fight, it's already been won,
Right.
through Christ's sacrifice. It's not about struggling in vain, but about tapping into that strength and resilience that's already available.
And that's something we can all relate to in a way, right? Even if we don't subscribe to the specific theology.
Absolutely.
The idea that even in the midst of challenges and darkness, there's this source of hope and strength that we can all draw on. But before we get into those broader applications, I think we need to unpack a little bit about how Pastor G frames this whole concept of spiritual warfare within the context of evangelical Christianity.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's really important to understand.
Okay, so let's move on to part 2.
So to really get what he's saying, you got to kind of understand the foundation,
Right.
For evangelical Christians, the Bible, well, it's like their ultimate source of truth, right?
Yeah.
The Bible, well, it's full of all these passages that talk about this cosmic battle between good and evil with angels and demons and all of that.
So for them, it's not just a metaphor, this spiritual warfare.
No, not at all. They believe it's a real thing.
Wow.
It's happening all around us.
So then our choices, even our thoughts, they're all part of this battle.
Exactly. They believe that every little thing we do can have spiritual consequences.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure.
It is, but Pastor G, he tries to give people ways to deal with that pressure.
Oh, okay. So does he ever talk about how to recognize signs of this battle in your everyday life?
He does. He talks about how temptations, even just negative thoughts,
Right.
those can be signs of demonic influence.
Wow.
He even says sometimes physical ailments can be connected to that.
So it's not enough to just wait for God to take care of everything.
Right. You have to actively resist.
Okay.
He says you got to pray, you got to study the scriptures, you got to surround yourself with other believers.
That idea of community, I mean, it seems really important.
Oh, absolutely. He talks about the church as this united front, a source of strength.
But like we were talking about earlier, you haven't really felt that support lately, have you?
No, not really. And it makes me wonder, what happens when that support system breaks down?
Right.
If the church is supposed to be this powerful force for good, what happens when it's not there for you?
It's a tough question.
It is. It's like there's this tension within Christianity itself.
How so?
Well, on one hand, you're supposed to take personal responsibility for your salvation.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're also told you need community. You need collective action.
It's like you need both, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Pastor G, I think he's really trying to bridge that gap.
How?
He tells you to fight, 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 fight.
Right. That individual action.
But then he also stresses the importance of unity.
Like when he says, "Church, let us unite."
Yeah, it's a powerful image.
It's a call to action for sure.
It is. And it makes me think about how important it is to find that sense of community and support.
Especially these days with everything feeling so isolating.
Exactly. And Pastor Guy's book, even with all the talk about spiritual warfare, it really comes back to that need for connection, for purpose.
Yeah, it's a fundamental human need.
It is. But, like we were saying before, some of his ideas, like that whole thing about the mark of the devil, can be kind of hard to swallow.
How do you reconcile that with the message of hope and all of that?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer,
Yeah.
I think for me, it comes down to realizing that faith, it's a journey.
Yeah.
It changes over time.
Right.
And we can find inspiration from different sources, even if we don't agree with every single thing.
So you can appreciate the core message even if you don't agree with all the specifics.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so great to learn about all these different beliefs and perspectives.
It's like a buffet. You take what you like and leave the rest.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of taking what we like, maybe it's time to talk about how some of these concepts, the spiritual warfare, the resilience, how they can apply to our lives, even if we don't subscribe to all the beliefs.
I think that's a great idea. Because even if you don't believe in a literal devil or demons, you can still relate to that feeling of, fighting against negativity.
Absolutely. And Pastor G, even though he's coming from a specific tradition, he offers some really useful insights and strategies.
So let's explore that. It's funny because when he talks about these struggles as part of this bigger spiritual battle, it makes me think about that quote from Timothy, "Fight the good fight of faith." Even if we think about faith, more broadly, it still speaks to that drive we have to overcome stuff to keep pushing for something better.
Yeah. I mean, whether we call it spiritual warfare or something else, we all have things we're fighting for.
For sure.
It's like social justice movements or, those battles with addiction or even just trying to be a better person.
Yeah. And just like Pastor Guy has those weapons for his warriors.
Right.
We all have tools and things that help us fight our own battles.
Yeah, for sure.
What are some of the things that have helped you?
Well, mindfulness has been huge for me. Like that whole name it to tame it thing, When I can actually just observe my thoughts and my feelings, it helps me to not get so caught up in the negativity.
Right.
And then I can actually choose how I want to respond.
That makes sense.
Therapy has been amazing too.
Yeah.
Just for working through some deeper issues and learning how to cope.
Yeah. Those are really powerful tools. And it makes me think about how Pastor Guy talks about the importance of prayer.
Oh, yeah.
Even if we're not praying to a specific God or anything, that act of connecting to something bigger than ourselves, whether it's nature or art or even a community of people, it can give us that grounding that we need.
I totally agree. And speaking of community, that's something that really stuck with me from Pastor Guy's book. You know how he calls for the church to unite?
Yeah. It's like a rally cry.
It is. And even though I'm not part of a traditional church or anything, I've found so much strength in connecting with people who share my values.
Yeah. It's like that saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Exactly.
And it makes me think about how we can all create that sense of community, whether it's volunteering or joining a group or even just reaching out to a friend. Sometimes just knowing you're not alone in the struggle can make all the difference.
100%.
Yeah.
And just like Pastor Guy reminds his readers that the victory is already won, I think it's important to remember that even when things are tough, there's always hope.
Right.
Just showing up and doing the work, that's what shows our resilience.
That's powerful. It's like we're all on our own hero's journey.
Totally. And that last point he makes about the mark of the devil and removing it.
Yeah.
Even though the language might not work for everyone, I think it speaks to something we all want.
Yeah. What's that?
Transformation and growth.
Yeah.
We all have those parts of ourselves that we want to let go of.
Yeah, for sure.
The things that hold us back.
And sometimes letting go of those things, it can feel like a real battle.
It can. But just like Pastor Guy says, we don't have to fight alone.
Right.
There's strength in community, in connecting and asking for help when we need it.
And ultimately, it's about trusting the journey, right?
Yes. Embracing the ups and the downs. Knowing that even in the dark, there's always light to be found.
That's a beautiful thought. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Pastor Guy's idea of spiritual warfare, I think what we can take away from it is this. Whether or not we believe in a literal battle between good and evil, we can all find something in his message of resilience, courage, and the power of community.
Absolutely. And remember, you're not alone in your struggles.
Yeah.
We all have our battles. But with the right tools and the right support, we can overcome anything.
So true. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you found something useful here.
Until next time.